I'm gonna sneeze. Just a little bit. Hello, everyone. Welcome to A Fistful of Dice. My name is Matt, and this is going to be my second video in the My 30-Day World project. If you are unfamiliar with My 30-Day World, there are links down in the description. It's a fun initiative that we're hosting at Absolute Tabletop, where basically for 30 days, every day you answer a single question about an aspect of your world that you maybe haven't thought of or haven't explored. It's a good way to both create new worlds, but also to consider things in worlds that you've maybe played in for a long time that you aren't necessarily thinking about. So I did do another video in this series talking about my homebrew world of Gloam, which is a homebrew setting that I'm sort of developing alongside Tim Carney, also with Absolute Tabletop. So I'm going to continue that here and do another 5 or 6 questions to catch up, because I have not been keeping up with it every day. So I'm a bad world builder. But I do want to urge you guys to check out the Dead Man's Guide to Dragongrin Kickstarter, which is kind of the thing that we're running in conjunction with My 30-Day World. The link is down in the description. It's an awesome campaign setting guide and world building toolkit for creating a dark fantasy world and for playing in the sort of dystopian fantasy world of Dragongrin, where evil has won and heroes just aren't welcome anymore. All right, so let's get started with some My 30-Day World questions. So we left off last time with the question, what event in your world altered its history? I believe was the question we left off with. So we're going to roll through a few others today. So just, if you didn't watch the first video, I recommend you go do that. But Gloam is it's sort of a dark horror kind of fantasy world with Victorian colonial aesthetics. There's firearms, there's airships, things like that. But the world is sort of pre-apocalyptic, where the end of the world is steadily approaching, and there's not really anything that humanity can do about it. And there's lots of like Cthulhu kind of stuff in there, so it's a fun little world that we've been kind of tinkering with. So, and this is a good way to sort of like answer questions about it. Again, none of these answers are going to be like concrete or canon. You know, we may publish some stuff in Gloam at some point, and some of this stuff may change or shift or whatever. So, anyway, enough of my yakking. Let's boogie. All right, so the first question that I'm going to be answering in this video is how prevalent is magic and where does it come from? So this is going to be an interesting question for Gloam, because the magic in Gloam is sort of different, the way that it works, both arcane and divine magic. And so the way I like to think of it, just without, talking about it for 20 or 30 minutes, is that divine magic in Gloam does come from the gods. And arcane magic comes from the Gloam itself. And so the way I like to think of it is like arcane magic has always existed in this world. There have always been people who are capable of doing magic. In fact, in the like human empire known as the Crown, there are sanctioned magic users, arcane magic users called Ordists, and they get funding from the Crown in order to do experiments, develop new weapons. Like, these are the guys that made black powder, that made firearms. So they're kind of like, yes, they do arcane magic, but they're also kind of like alchemists and engineers and stuff, and they like make a lot of like cool magitech sort of stuff. They created the golems, which are these big hulking iron constructs that exist in this world. So the Ordists of this world are the sort of the primary arcane magic users. And if you are an arcane magic user who is not an Ordist, like someone who's not sanctioned by the Crown, then I haven't really thought too much about this, but maybe it's even illegal. Like, maybe this is a world where if you're practicing magic without an Ordist license, without being a sanctioned magic user, like maybe you can be sort of like imprisoned or even executed. Or maybe they take you and say, you're going to be an Ordist. Like, I kind of like that idea better, because I like to think that maybe like magic users are very rare in this world, and magic users who are capable of sort of manipulating the Gloam in a way that is both safe and like efficient. Maybe if the people find out, like, hey, there's a kid in this like slum in this city that is capable of magic, that maybe like guardsmen from the Crown would show up to take this kid and basically against his will, against his parents' will, they would take him and have him be trained as an Ordist. Like, I kind of like that idea. That I feel like that's in keeping with sort of the tone and the feel of Gloam. So I like to think of it like that. But then the other thing to mention is that because the Gloam is now seeping into the world, because the human empire sort of they killed all the most of the elves and the dwarves and sort of like took over this world. They also sort of a street sweeper just drove by. I've literally never seen a street sweeper here before. Good thing too. That street is dirty. So, like I said, arcane magic has always existed, but I think with the Gloam seeping into the world, with the destruction of these wards and sort of like the elimination of the old magics, right? Like the Gloam has seeped into the world, and arcane magic has become much more powerful and much more prevalent, but also much more volatile. Where it's like, you know, if you're doing arcane magic, you can be corrupted by the Gloam. You can go insane. You can go crazy. Like, you can become mutated and deformed and stuff like that. Like, very like Warhammer, like chaos magic sort of feel. And I'm not sure how that works mechanically, but just lore-wise, that's kind of how it works in my head. And then just briefly touching on divine magic. Divine magic comes from the gods, but the gods themselves have become warped and overtaken by the Gloam, where, like, you know, the people are still worshiping this pantheon of gods, unaware that these gods have basically been compromised. You know what I mean? Like, the gods are no longer gods, they're monstrous figures. And so I like the idea of, you know, paladins and clerics in this world who channel this divine magic eventually become corrupted by it as well. And that's something that Tim and I have talked about in the past, and something that we feel, you know, pretty strongly about, that's something that definitely exists in this world. So yeah, that's magic and Gloam. The next question is, how common are adventurers and heroes in your world? You know, this is a world where there's not really a safe place. There is a city called Oubliette, which is, it's sort of built up in the mountains. You can only get to it by airship. And that's it's sort of a safe place. It's kind of a bastion of humanity. You know, it's this last sort of fortified position that is untouched by the Gloam for the most part. But at the same time, it's where the crown and the creed operate. The crown being this monarchy, and the creed being, the church. And they're not exactly good guys. Like, I don't imagine them being like holy, good, just people. I think that they're fairly corrupt, and I think that they have been touched and warped by the Gloam much more than they think. And so there really isn't a safe place to be in this world. And so I imagine that adventurers are actually fairly common. People that kind of go out into the world, seeking, just food, board, a little bit of gold to their name would be good. I also like the idea of redemption being kind of a big theme in Gloam, because humanity fully recognizes that they're sort of responsible for what is happening in the world. And obviously, not everyone sort of realizes that. Like I mentioned in another video, there's not some farmer out in the field who's like, boy, we really, screwed up with the Black Crusades. They have no idea. But I do like the idea of redemption being a theme here. And so I think a lot of people sort of strike out looking for that redemption, looking for a way to overcome their own personal demons, looking into the abyss, as it were. That Nietzsche quote, he who fights with monsters should take care, he who looks, when you look into the abyss also looks back at you, sort of thing. I like that. That being a theme in Gloam, I think, is really cool. And so I think that, not just going out and being mercenaries, but going out and looking to redeem yourself and like save your soul is kind of a big theme here. So the next question is a really interesting one, and it's, what's your world's biggest secret? And I had to think about this for a little bit, and I think I kind of already mentioned this, but I think the biggest secret, the biggest thing that's like kind of like unknown to people, is this idea of their gods being corrupted by the Gloam. So here comes that street sweeper again. What are you doing? I mean, thank you, but like, we've gotten by just fine without a street sweeper up until this point. I don't even know why you're doing that. But the idea that this pantheon of gods, which at one time was very just and powerful and, upheld good and law, have devolved into this sort of like eldritch chaos. They have been overcome by the Gloam, twisted in its image, made to be servants to this inky darkness. I really like that idea because the people still worship these gods. They still look to these gods. They still pray to these gods for guidance, for help, for protection, for a good harvest, for a lucrative, business, safe family, healthy children. They still look to these gods for help, completely unaware that these gods are not listening anymore, or if they are, they're not the same gods that were there at one time, and so I think that's probably the biggest secret of the world. Okay, the next question, we're going to keep going until we catch up here, so we've got quite a bit. What is the cosmology of your world? Are there other planes? So Gloam is part of the greater cosmology of Arbitron, which is the sort of the shared universe of Absolute Tabletop. So my homebrew world of Aeronoth, where the Provokers play, is part of it. Dragon Grin is part of it. Enkea, which is Barker's world, is part of it. Kror is one of the moons. There are many worlds, infinite worlds in this universe, and they're all connected, and they're all separated by this thing known as the Bleak, right? And the Bleak is sort of this arcane maelstrom that makes travel between these worlds very, very difficult. And I actually drew, I don't have it handy, but I drew a picture of what I imagine this cosmology looking like at one point. And it's like an ocean of Bleak with land masses sort of floating and drifting on this Bleak. And there's a sun with moons sort of, wheeling in the sky overhead. And then there are two reflections, above there's the reflection of the Feywild, where all of the worlds are reflected in this mirror image that is overtaken by nature. And that's where sort of like divine nature magic comes from. And then there's a reflection below the Bleak, in the Bleak, that is the Shadowfell, or the Desolation, or the Shadow Plane, or whatever you want to call it. And that's, another mirror image there. So that's how I picture it, as like three planes, right? Literally planes, not just planes like planes of existence, but literally flat planes where, they're all mirrored by each other. So that's how I imagine it looking. But the thing about Gloam is that it has something that none of the other worlds have, which is the Gloam. And I like to think this is totally wet cement. I don't even think Tim and I have talked about this, but I like the idea that the Gloam itself is the Bleak, but it's somehow different. And I don't know why, and I don't know how, and I imagine that the sort of elder things that exist within the Gloam itself are probably responsible for it. But I like to think that the Gloam and the Bleak are one and the same. They're the same energy source. They're the same material, same resource. But the Gloam is different. It manifests differently in this world. So I like to think that the world of Gloam is maybe like distant to the other worlds of Arbitron. It's like on the outskirts, you know what I mean? Where maybe like the Bleak ends and there's just void or something, and that's what the Gloam is seeping into the world. But that's why I like to think of it. But yeah, to answer the question, like, it is part of the greater cosmology of Arbitron, and is connected to those other worlds. So the next question here, which faction in your world is feared and reviled? So I'm going to talk about the Ordos a little bit more, because I think that they're probably the most like feared and reviled, but also most necessary faction. So the Ordos, like I mentioned earlier in this video, are the sanctioned magic users of the world. They're responsible for the black powder, the Blaugus that lifts the airships, the dirigibles into the air. They also created the ogres. These gigantic hulking constructs, these mechs basically that exist in this world. But they're also the wielders of arcane magic. They can manipulate the Gloam and bend it to their will. And that makes them very scary, because you're essentially trusting these people who are oftentimes very selfish, I imagine. They're very they're very wizardy, where it's like, I want more power, I want more knowledge, I want to further my abilities at all times. That's how I imagine the Ordos being as well, with the additional kind of scary factor of them being sanctioned by the only remaining like government power in this world. And I imagine that Ordists, they're concentrated in the city of Oubliette, but they also go out and serve other towns and villages and cities and stuff. So you might, go to a frontier town, and there might be an Ordis there who is, doing experiments, but also like, providing alchemical concoctions and like healing and stuff for the people in this town. But I don't think that they're like doctors used to be in the real world, where they were sort of like if a doctor came to your house, it meant that someone was dying, sort of thing. And so doctors were sort of like a last resort, like an untrustworthy thing. And they didn't, not a lot of people respected doctors. They were sort of seen as these like butchers. That's how I imagine the Ordists are kind of received in this world, where it's like, oh yeah, they're a necessary evil. Like, we need them in case, all the cows come down with this plague or whatever, but they're doing weird experiments in their hut, and like sometimes like people are disappearing, and like sometimes weird like supernatural stuff happens in this town, and the Ordists are usually blamed for it. So I would say that the Ordists, and their actual organization is called the Ordos Terraeum, by the way. Ordos Terraeum, which is a cool word that Tim came up with. He's good about that kind of stuff. So the Ordos Terraeum is the faction that is most feared and reviled in the world of Gloam. Okay, a few more questions here till we catch up. The next question is, who opposes evil and injustice in your world? I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but I like the idea that, adventurers are going out into the world seeking redemption and wanting to fight against the Gloam, doing what little they can against this sort of futile march towards apocalypse. But also the Dawnhammers, the remaining Dawnhammers, they're sort of like a scattered, divided faction that used to exist. They were very prominent during the Black Crusades. They're very like Solomon Kane, like puritanical warriors, dressing in black and white, carrying flintlocks and sabers and hatchets and stuff like that. They oppose evil and injustice. That's sort of their deal. They're like monster hunters. So the Dawnhammers for sure. The next question is an interesting one too. What iconic monsters exist in your world? This is something that like we haven't thought a ton about, but I am going to talk a little bit about. I'm going to talk about elves because they're probably the thing that I've thought the most about in this world, and they're very inspired by Lloyd, the RLDM, his world of Eastcloft, which is this sort of Viking-themed world. Lots of Norse mythology and stuff. The elves in his world, and he talks about this a lot, are very like alien and unknown and scary, and they're almost fiendish in nature, where they're like striking deals and they're kind of like tricksters and stuff like that. So I was very inspired by that idea of like making elves really alien and scary. And so in Gloam, the elves used to be the keepers of the old magics, and sort of they maintained the wards that kept the Gloam at bay. But they were wiped out by humanity in the Black Crusades. Almost nearly wiped out. And the old magic was sort of wiped from Gloam, and the wards were cast down, and the Gloam seeped into the world. The elves, in desperation, sought to control the Gloam, and in doing so, they became these warped monstrosities, now known as ghasts. Oh my god, I'm burping so much. Excuse me. And they're terrifying to behold. They do resemble elves in that they have very sort of like fine, lithe bodies, very fine features, pointy ears, that sort of thing. They dwell in the wildlands, in the wilderness, in the forest, and things like that. They revere nature, but they are twisted and malformed. Their necks are like unnaturally long. Their limbs are so long and lanky that they almost drag on the ground. They have an extra thumb. Their eyes are black. Their ears are huge. Their hair lank. Their face is gaunt. They look very monstrous. And in classic Fey fashion, iron burns them. So this is one of the reasons why black powder weapons were so effective, is because you could put a ball of iron in an elf from a distance and it would burn them from the inside out. And so they fear iron, and iron burns them because they are creatures of the Fey. And they have access to dark magic. They can control the Gloam, manipulate the Gloam, They can become more powerful by taking in the Gloam, and they also, as you'll see in a game that I ran here called So Distant the Dawn, they have other creatures at their disposal, elemental creatures that have also been twisted by the Gloam, that are part of their army. So they are silent hunters, they're sentinels of the woods, they are vengeful creatures. Two more questions. This next question is, who dominates the political spheres of your world? Definitely the Creed and the Crown are the two things that most definitely dominate the political spheres. So the Creed it's a matriarchal monarchy. There's a queen who rules over Oubliette and sort of the remaining human dominion. She has regents or barons that sort of oversee the different regions of this world of Gloam, and so there are barons and baronesses and lords and stuff that sort of oversee these different areas, and they squabble with each other and war sometimes as well. And these are sort of classic nobility where they sort of refuse to acknowledge what's going on in the world. They refuse to acknowledge the Gloam. They're sort of this, keep calm and carry on sort of mentality. And so it's harmful. It's very regressive sort of thing, because there are plenty of people in the world who are hey, we need to be doing something about this Gloam situation, and the queen is nah, it's all good. We're good. We achieved what we wanted to achieve. The Black Crusades happened. We took over. There are no more elves. There are no more dwarves. Life is good. Look at this city that we've built. This splendid city in the sky, built into the mountains that's only reachable by dirigible. This is a wonder of science and technology and magic. And everyone else is yeah, that's all well and good, but my farm, got destroyed by tentacle monsters and my wife got carried off, that sort of thing. So, the Creed is the religion, the Crown is the matriarchy. Both of them sort of ruling hand in hand, are both sort of detrimental and regressive here in Gloam. And the final question we're going to be tackling today is, how safe is it to travel in your world? It is incredibly dangerous to travel in Gloam, I imagine. There is a road called the Withered Road that runs all the way from Oubliette all the way to sort of the far frontier of the human dominion. And this is probably the safest way to travel, is staying on this road, or traveling by dirigible would be safe. But traveling by dirigible is not always economical. It's quite expensive to charter flights on dirigibles. But the Withered Road is probably the safest way for most people to travel, and it's still beset by all sorts of horrors and dangers. And, if you go beyond the Withered Road and go out into the frontier, out into the wilderness, it becomes increasingly difficult to stay alive. There are all sorts of monstrous things out there. There are elves, there are dwarves, but more so than that, there are warped monstrous creatures either spawned from the Gloam itself or warped and twisted by the presence of the Gloam. So it is not safe at all to travel in Gloam. In fact, it's quite dangerous, and I assume most people would just stay in their homes. But like I mentioned, adventurers are commonplace. They strike out looking for something more, looking for something better, looking for a spark of hope, even though none exists. So so that was quite a few questions in my 30-day world. We're about halfway through it now. I'm going to continue doing these as often as I can, trying to do 1 or 2 a week and catch up on the questions that I miss about the world of Gloam. So again, if you're interested in taking part, it's not too late. It's so easy to jump in just wherever. If you want to catch up, you can. If you want to just pick and choose the questions that appeal to you, that apply to your world, you absolutely can. There's no wrong way to do my 30-day world. You can do videos, you can share on Twitter, you can share on Facebook, blog posts. You can write it down in your own notebook and not share it if you want to. Just do it however you want to do it. But use that hashtag my30dayworld and make sure that you keep boosting that signal. So, and again, the Dead Man's Guide to Dragon Grin Kickstarter is still live. We have about, I think, 20 days to go here. And we're blowing through stretch goals, and we've got some more stretch goals to announce. So definitely check out those links down in the description. As always, guys, thank you so much. Take care. Happy gaming all. And tell us about your world, man. My 30-day world. Get in it.